Hi folks, it's Evo here from the Thundermist Lure Company, and welcome to today's segment of Thundermist Fishing Tips. You know, recently one of our subscribers, Green Gibson, wrote in and asked what's the difference between monofilament, fluorocarbon, and braided line. Well, you know what folks, that's probably one of our most frequent asked questions that we get on our website. So we're put together a three-part series and we're going to do just that. We're going to talk about mono, braided, and fluorocarbon line. And today we're going to talk about monofilament on part one, and we're going to talk about the advantages, disadvantages, and when you should use monofilament line. So let's start right off the bat with the advantages of mono, because you know what folks, there really isn't many. One of the advantages of monofilament line, it's relatively inexpensive. It doesn't cost a lot of money, you can get a lot of line, and the other advantage is it's readily available. Most stores will carry it, you can find it pretty much anywhere. Other than that, the only other advantage of monofilament, which is more of a disadvantage, and I'll explain why, is the fact that it stretches. But I'm going to come back to that though. So that's really it as far as advantages go. As far as disadvantages though, with monofilament, there's plenty. And that's why I really don't like using monofilament line that much. For example, I mentioned stretch. Right now I've got a fair amount of line out there. If I go to set the hook with monofilament and I lean back into them, there's so much stretch in that line, you would think that your hook would be setting into the fish's mouth, but not necessarily. It might only be penetrating just a bit because there's a lot of stretch and a lot of give. The other thing with monofilament, it's not very abrasion resistant. So if I'm fishing the rocks and I'm going over top of rocks and structure, it'll get nicked real easy. And once it gets nicked, it weakens significantly. So that's another big disadvantage of monofilament. The other disadvantage is if you have heavier line, it's real thick, and you just simply can't use like a 40-pound test line on a spinning reel. So you're basically limited to 20-pound tests and under on spinning. Of course, you could use the heavier line on bait casting, but that's another disadvantage to mono. But probably the two key disadvantages to monofilament line. Disadvantage number one, it absorbs water. So if I'm using monofilament, it's sitting in the water, it's absorbing water, and over time it's going to just continue to weaken because of that water absorption factor. So that's not a good quality to have. The second thing is it absorbs light. So we've got a lot of sunlight happening here today, but monofilament line will even absorb regular light that you have in a store or even at home for that matter. So monofilament should really always be kept in the dark, and that's the thing, when it's sitting on the shelf in your store, it's getting weak because it's absorbing that light from the store. And I don't know if you've ever bought a pack of monofilament line and you go to use it and you tie a knot and it just breaks off, or it breaks off easy when you're fighting a fish. That's most likely because it's old line. And quite frankly, monofilament line really should have a shelf life. I wish they put a manufacture date on the package because it doesn't age very well. So there's a lot of disadvantages to monofilament line, but when should you use monofilament? Well, I mentioned before about the stretch being kind of an advantage and a disadvantage. I don't mind using monofilament if I'm casting a topwater bait and working a topwater bait, or if I'm using a crankbait. And the reason for that is, on a topwater bait, when you get a hit, you want that little bit of hesitation before you set the hook. So the fact that there's a little bit of stretch actually is a good thing. And same with the crankbait. When the fish hits and you go to set the hook, that little bit of stretch gives that extra fraction of a second, and it makes for a better hook set. So really the only time I would use mono is if I'm using a topwater bait or a crankbait. And even then, there's some other high stretch fluorocarbon lines you can get into. But if I was going to use mono, that would be the time and the place I would use it. So if you use mono as a regular general rule, what I would suggest is, if you're out on the water a lot, after each weekend or after a couple weeks, strip off a little bit of line, cut it off, get rid of it, because that line's been sitting in the water and been getting weak over time. And then if you're fishing often, you continue to do that, and maybe you want to re-spool 2-3 times throughout the course of the year. But if you only fish a few times in a year, one spool of mono is fine, but at the end of the year, take it off and re-spool with some fresh line, because it's cheap and it's just not worth keeping that old monofilament line on there. So that's about it for mono. Stay tuned for part 2, folks, coming up. We're going to talk about fluorocarbon line, but in the meanwhile, I hope you've enjoyed today's segment. And as always, folks, until next time, good luck, good fishing.